Hello and welcome to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Alasdair McEwen, and this week I spoke to Guy Edwards to find out about the outcome of the Colombian government's headline-making pledge to cease oil and gas exploration. Guy is an expert in the politics of the energy transition in Colombia from the University of Sussex, and he's a member of the Global South Working Group of the Climate Social Science Network, looking at climate obstruction in Latin America. He's carried out over 50 interviews for his doctoral project, researching the people that are shaping Colombia's energy transition, including talking with former government ministers, senior civil servants, academics, NGO activists, industry representatives, journalists, and other experts in the country's mining and energy sector. So this episode really is him sharing his insights from these conversations and exploring in particular President Gustavo Petro's pledge to end the awarding of new oil and gas exploration contracts. We thought we'd look into this issue in part because in a previous podcast, which you may have listened to, and if not, I'd recommend that you listen back to, I had interviewed Wim Carton and Andreas Malm about their book Overshoot, where they described Colombia as an inspiring case study of where stranding oil and gas assets was being attempted. So we thought we'd look into how this was going in more depth.
Petro presidency has been like an earthquake for Colombian politics. Petro's agenda has represented a serious rupture with what's come before. There's no question that I think compared to Ivan Duque or Juan Manuel Santos, Gustavo Petro represents something very different. And I think we can see that in Petro's energy transition particularly.
I began the conversation by asking Guy to explain the current extent of Colombia's economic dependence on fossil fuels.
So Colombia is highly dependent on fossil fuels, and it represents about 7% of the country's GDP and about 30% of its foreign investment and over half of its exports. So the country is super dependent on fossil fuels, and particularly for its macroeconomic stability. In addition to that, for its power sector, coal and gas thermoelectric plants play a key role, especially during El Nino years where water scarcity is particularly pronounced and Colombia's hydroelectric capacity is diminished. So last year, for instance, there was some pretty bad droughts. So they had to basically kind of max out Colombia's coal and gas thermoelectric plants because of the extent to which the hydroelectric plants were struggling. Gustavo Petro, when he won the election in June 2022, he was elected on the basis of a very ambitious agenda, and particularly for the energy transition, he had a number of pretty radical pledges, which really represented a break from the previous administration, or indeed any Colombian government which had preceded it. And the standout commitment for me was this pledge not to award new oil and gas exploration contracts. In a country very dependent on fossil fuels, this went down like a lead balloon with the mining and energy sector. The government has been in a serious tug of war with the industry in terms of its goals. Some of these battles, both within the government and played out across media and other forums, is something I've been trying to explore for my doctoral thesis, because I think it's rather handy to show how messy energy transitions can be in practice.
Can you take us through the details of the actual pledge? Then we can talk about how it plays out.
Yeah, so if you look at Petro's government plan, on which he was elected, it literally says we will not award new hydrocarbons contracts, exploration contracts. And that's really the only detail there is. So this is where things start to get a little complicated and a little messy, I would say. Colombia currently has over 300 contracts. So what the government had to come out quickly saying was that they would respect all existing contracts, because that wasn't necessarily clear just from the government plan. And because of Petro's quite feisty rhetoric against private sector actors, Colombian elites, the damage of the fossil fuel industry generally, as you can imagine, fossil fuel incumbents were nervous by this pledge and the lack of details. So if you look at kind of news coverage from late 2022 and early 2023, government spokespeople, the energy and mining minister, the vice minister of mining and energy had to come out repeatedly and say, we're going to respect the contracts. It's fine. Everything will continue. What they want to do, they said, was basically just max out the existing contracts. And that's where they had to do quite a bit of work to justify the pledge, but also describe why they were doing it.
Okay. And what were the motivations then? Why were they doing it?
Essentially, the reasons come down to not wanting to expand Colombia's oil and gas frontier. They wanted to stick with their existing areas of exploration and production, and Colombia's commitment to climate change. This idea that as fossil fuels are the primary cause of anthropogenic climate change, Colombia is a large oil and gas producer and coal exporter as well, has a role to play in this agenda. It's a response to concerns about the global energy transition and the fact that Colombia's oil, particularly, it's quite expensive to produce and it's not as competitive as other markets. So if countries are going to be decarbonizing, who is Colombia hoping to export to? They made a decision that with the existing contracts they have, over 300, they could max out these contracts and use the financing to support the transition to a decarbonized economy, try and boost productive sectors like agriculture, tourism, and of course, renewable energy.
A lot of this is about an economic transition and adapting to a new climate post-energy transition world. And you say that wasn't particularly well communicated.
It's tricky. The Petro presidency has been like an earthquake for Colombian politics. Petro's agenda has represented a serious rupture with what's come before. There's no question that I think compared to Iván Duque or Juan Manuel Santos, Gustavo Petro represents something very different. And I think we can see that in Petro's energy transition particularly. And I think the main difference, I would say, with the Duque administration particularly is that Petro said we will not do fracking. So fracking, which had been promoted by Santos and Duque, was suspended, pilot projects which were ended. And this idea that Petro was willing to explore limiting fossil fuel expansion through this contracts pledge. And I think that represents probably the biggest rupture with the Duque administration, particularly, which was willing to sign or did sign over 60 new oil and gas licenses or contracts. So this rupture with the Duque administration and Petro's emphasis on kind of supply side climate policies and thinking about limiting or ending fossil fuel expansion is a major change for a country which is heavily dependent on fossil fuels and has a very established energy and mining industry. We're talking over 500,000 employees. Major companies are present there or have been present there, such as ExxonMobil and others. And Ecopetrol, Colombia's national oil company, is the largest company in the country and has been described as the country's golden egg. Petro was seen to be or perceived to be threatening this. But I think this is where some of the contradictions come in, because whilst Petro said that he wanted to end fossil fuel expansion, he has said he wants to ratchet up fossil fuel production, at least in the short term, because that's what is financing his very ambitious social agenda. So there are some contradictions there, and fossil gas has been given a free pass. And this is something I've been trying to look at, that if you just looked at Petro's speeches at the UN or Davos in 2023 or various other platforms, he talks a lot about fossil capital and fossil fuels representing death. And this very visceral language that he tends to use, not exclusively for fossil fuels, but he's clearly in favor of gas, as is Colombia's fossil fuel industry more generally. So there is consensus that gas should be used as a bridge fuel. But of course, this is just locking Colombia further in to fossil fuel dependency.
Given that the pledge was brief and that doesn't seem to be that there was much accompanying detail with it. I mean, I read in your work, you say that there were some contradictions within government itself about how it was carrying out that policy. I think it was one of the finance ministers was actually going against the policy, perhaps, either way, there was this kind of, there wasn't a clarity or coherence in the way that this policy was kind of followed through with.
Exactly. So Jose Antonio Ocampo, who was Petro's first finance minister, was seemingly skeptical or against this pledge. And you can see this in some of the coverage at the time where, for example, towards the end of early 2023, the team at the Ministry of Mining and Energy, led at the time by the Minister Irene Vélez, they were quite vocal about this commitment: no new oil and gas contracts, this key part of Petro's energy transition. Ocampo at the time was perfectly happy to contradict the Ministry of Mining and Energy publicly, and it's widely covered in the press, saying that decision hasn't been taken. And I think there was clearly some intra-ministerial challenges or differences of opinion there. And this seemingly undermines, I think, the pledge to some extent, because it gave license to all of those opposing the pledge to obviously speak to this internal differences and just try and keep beating the drum that Petro is trying to end oil and gas contracts and threatens Colombia's oil and gas industry more broadly. But of course, when you look at the details, they were explicit about respecting existing contracts, and there was actually efforts to increase production. So I think there was clearly a kind of effort by fossil fuel incumbents or those against the Petro government to shape narratives and discourses in the media that this pledge represented a broader threat to Colombia's oil and gas industry, but it didn't.
Yeah, it'd be good to go into more detail about the actors that tried to undermine the pledge. You speak of the media was involved, the oil and gas and mining industries, etc. But just to go and give us a little bit more of a picture of who and how they were doing that.
Colombia's mining and energy industry is substantial. So a lot of the industry figures were incredibly vocal in their opposition against this oil and gas contracts pledge. And of course, you've got the Colombian Oil and Gas Association, ACP. You've got the main gas lobbying association, Naturgas, and any number of other actors such as consultants or former ministers, of course, or indeed the former president, Iván Duque. They all came out swinging against the oil and gas pledge. And this opposition has been sustained over the last couple of years, and it's been pretty fierce. I think Iván Duque described the pledge not to award new oil and gas contracts as social and economic suicide, or that Petro was threatening to destroy the economy. One would expect industry figures to have these discourses and narratives, but the extent to which politicians from different parties, and of course, a lot of media figures as well, and academics, and also some environmentalists. And I think this probably was one of the most striking revelations, that a former environment minister was against the pledge, and the rector of a prestigious Colombian university as well, who's an ecologist, they're against this pledge as well. And I think invariably with these things, you have to look at the details because, of course, Colombia's main source of emissions comes from deforestation. And if you want to end deforestation, you need a lot of finance, you need a lot of government capacity in areas where the state is not necessarily present. Essentially, their argument is we need finance from the energy and mining industry to finance efforts to control deforestation and increase the presence of the state. So in the short term, you can kind of see where they're coming from. But of course, we know unless we curtail the burning of fossil fuels, climate change will continue. And that is one of the main threats to biodiversity. And of course, Amazon dieback is seen as one of the main threats. So given Colombia represents a tiny amount of emissions, I think it is 0.6% of global emissions, there was an argument that, why are we doing this? We don't need to do this. We're not first in line. And they're right that major fossil fuel producers, the US or Norway or rich countries like the UK, should be first in phasing out fossil fuels. But we know that the energy transition has to be orchestrated in a gradual and progressive fashion. And Colombia needs to start now. So the pledge, I think, was correct to make. But I think there was probably some legitimate questions raised about how it was executed and how it was communicated. And this kind of vacuum that was left, given the lack of details or lack of kind of a more progressive or proactive communication strategy, left some of the opposition actors to fill in the gaps. And that was, I think, rather counterproductive.
Have these actors been successful in undermining the pledge, would you say?
I mean, as of now, mid-June 2025, the contracts pledge has been maintained. So no new oil and gas contracts have been signed. And this is because the Petro government said, we've got over 300 existing contracts. We're going to try and max them out. Some of them have been suspended. Some of them have been described as lazy contracts, contratos perezosos, this idea that they're just not even doing anything, that some of those fossil fuel actors that sign the contracts haven't been actually actively exploring. So this idea of trying to max out existing contracts is ongoing. In that respect, the pledge is successful, but where it gets a little tricky is what we were describing before about how it was communicated, the reasons it was put together in the first place, and perhaps the lack of awareness or anticipation of how considerable the backlash would be. And here I'm a little conflicted. I'm still working through my interviews because I think to some extent the Petro government has looked for conflict. If you just look at his Twitter account, if you see how kind of fierce and how aggressive some of his tweets are, how confrontational they are, I think to some extent he likes to pick fights. So be it with private sector actors or whoever, the biggest blow up he had was with the Trump administration, which he had to roll back rapidly before the US leveraged massive tariffs on the Colombian economy. The US is Colombia's key trading partner, and incidentally it exports most of its oil to the US. So he's definitely got himself in pretty hot water on a number of occasions by this quite aggressive tweeting. One could argue he wanted this confrontation with the fossil fuel industry. He wanted to expose what he describes as fossil fuel capital and how there's this hegemonic cultural battle that needs to be waged against these actors. Fair enough. If that's what you want to do, that's fine. He is the president. He was elected. But to what extent that helps his cause to actually orchestrate energy transition? Because when you look at some of the details, the dialogue with the fossil fuel industry was not as extensive as it could have been. This idea of bringing these people with you, that's where the pledge has its limitations.
What's your view on whether the pro-fossil fuel narrative has dominated? Is it fair to say that there's been a media and domination to which public opinion and policymakers are quite influenced, that this transition doesn't look as good as it maybe looked 2 or 3 years ago before the pledge was made?
I think that's a tricky question to answer for a couple of reasons, namely that from 2023, 2024, Colombia suffered a particularly harsh El Nino phenomena where there was water scarcity, pretty bad drought. And when Colombia's hydropower was compromised because of the droughts, Colombia's thermoelectric plants had to come to the rescue. And to avoid power cuts, they had to crank up the generating capacity of these thermoelectric plants, which of course is totally understandable. So this gave a wonderful opportunity to fossil fuel incumbents, and particularly natural gas, whose spokesman, Luz Estela Morgas, is connected to the International Gas Union. And essentially it gave them a wonderful opening to show how important fossil fuels are to Colombia's economy and society. So I think that complicated matters, and for Colombia's rollout of renewable energy projects, particularly wind and solar, there have been some delays for a number of reasons, but the government perhaps has not been able to roll out non-conventional renewable energy projects as quickly as it hoped. No question there has been progress in a number of areas, but the perception is that it hasn't been happening fast enough. And it really gave an opportunity to fossil fuel incumbents to say, hold on, this energy transition, we're lurching for this other branch that we're not really able to reach. And we're seemingly gutting our oil and gas industry, which wasn't the case at all. But that's a discourse they were able to promote.
What do you see as the overall lessons of this pledge? If other governments are similar to Colombia are trying this, what should the lessons for them be?
There's multiple positive lessons to take from this and some tricky lessons as well. Colombia was right to make this pledge. It showed bravery and proactiveness, given we've already broken the 1.5 degree limit. We need this level of ambition. The pledge is important, not just for the climate battle, but also for Colombia's macroeconomic stability. If the energy and mining sector represent over half of your exports, and if other countries are decarbonizing, who are you exporting to in the coming years? So this idea that you need a gradual energy transition, trying to increase the importance of other productive sectors in your economy, such as tourism and agriculture, to gradually replace these oil and coal exports. Since gas isn't exported, that's only for domestic consumption. So just trying to replace oil and coal exports, this is going to take time. So you need to do that. And I think Colombia's efforts to put together this kind of portfolio for the socio-ecological transition, trying to leverage 40 billion in foreign investment. They're building their country platform at the moment to house this portfolio and to try and leverage support from international donors. The Inter-American Development Bank is helping with this. Clearly, there is a lot of progress that's been made and some very important signals made by the government. So I think in that respect, one would hope other countries would take similar steps. And of course, developed countries, especially the UK, Norway, and the US, should be leading on this first and increasing their climate finance to developing countries, making these pledges. But on the flip side, perhaps some of the more difficult lessons to learn is that there's a big difference between campaigning and governing. And I think quite a few people from my interview data suggested that Petro's government struggle in some cases, not all cases. In some cases, some ministers kind of struggle to make this shift from more activist backgrounds to governing and being perhaps a bit more cautious, being perhaps a bit more diplomatic in some of their language and some of their interventions. Because, of course, in an economy where the energy and mining sector is so important, you need to bring these people with you. Just this idea that if you are going to confront fossil fuel actors, you have to anticipate the control and the level of complicity that exists in some media outsources who are willing to copy paste industry talking points and platform fossil fuel incumbent actors.
We've got a situation now where, so there's the next presidential elections, in 2026? What chances does a leftist government now have?
I think the first thing I would say is that I looked at some of the leading candidates for the presidential elections the other day, and all of them except one, who is a colleague of Gustavo Petro's, are in favor of signing new oil and gas contracts and are in favor of fracking. So I think if one of these candidates does win, the chances that this pledge survives is minimal. As anyone looking at an energy transition appreciates quickly, there's no black and white answers. It's such a messy process that even if the next government wanted new oil and gas contracts, who will their investors be? Who is actually interested? There has been interest in the last couple of years, but there's too many other variables that are out of Colombia's control to say that it's guaranteed that new oil and gas contracts would be signed. But I think it's highly likely there would be interest. So I think that's out of the government's hands for the most part. But what they can do is really go all out on trying to secure support for the country platform, for investments in renewable energy, reindustrialization, tourism, sustainable agriculture, to get the country less dependent on oil and coal exports.
To what extent will oil and gas policy be a part of election campaigning and narratives, do you think, in next year?
I don't think it's a priority right now. I looked at a survey the other day with over 1,000 leading actors in Colombia, politicians, business leaders, and the energy transition didn't really rank that high. As you can imagine, security concerns following the attempted assassination of Senator Miguel Uribe Turbay last week, that's kind of dominating the headlines. Petro's seemingly failed total peace strategy with armed groups and organized crime, and trying to get a handle on organized crime as well. These are probably going to be the more pressing issues. I think the energy transition will feature, but within the context of rescuing Colombia's economy and boosting growth and using the oil, gas and mining industries as a kind of key plank of that. And probably revert back to Duque's energy transition strategy, which was essentially do the demand side, electrify transport, renewable energy, but leave the fossil fuel industry alone for the most part, given its importance for public finance. But I do hope there's more debate on how Colombia has actually benefited from its mining and energy industry. Because we can look at it in terms of the macroeconomic stability, source of external investment, exports, etc., importance for balance of payments. But in a country which is the most unequal in Latin America, one of the most unequal in the world, if it's got this golden egg, who's actually sharing a piece of it? And you could argue that because of the royalty system, Colombia's 32 departments have received the benefits of this industry. But when some of the social and economic issues are so pressing, what's really been the benefit of this industry?
Your research suggests that there isn't a kind of cohesive or organized effort to undermine the climate agenda, but there is actually something emerging now as a result maybe of this pledge.
This idea of a kind of formal network of actors trying to oppose Colombia's energy transition, which have been identified in other places such as the US, for example, I don't think there does exist necessarily a kind of coordinated network, but I think there's clearly informal networks at play. And I was able to attend a couple of fossil fuel events in the Colombian Congress and then in Valledupar in Cesar, which is a big coal producing region. And it was the extent to which all the speakers, they seemed to all know each other. They seemed mostly to be sharing the same talking points. And they quite regularly referred to previous encounters or meetings or events that they had been at or participated in together. And that got me thinking about this idea of the existence of informal networks or whether there is something perhaps more coordinated. But I think where there is clearly alignment is that Petro's energy transition agenda is a major threat to them, and they have been motivated to come out swinging against it. And the element that I think also exists is the transnational component. So the International Gas Union, of which Ella Morgas, the president of Naturgas, she's part of that. So the extent to which kind of discourses, narratives or strategies are being shared across countries, there's probably a reasonable chance that is the case.
I just wondered about if there had been any economic impact of the pledge, and if you could maybe just explain what that might have been.
There's been a lot of debate about the extent to which Petro's energy transition agenda has affected Colombia's economy. And from my understanding, investment in the energy and mining sector, oil and gas and coal, has decreased. But investment in renewable energy seemingly has been quite impressive. So I think we should definitely differentiate between the two. Colombia's credit rating under the Duque administration did suffer. And from my understanding, there has been some talk of the devaluation of the Colombian peso occurring as a result of some of Petro's kind of rhetoric about the fossil fuel industry. But I think there was actually global headwinds which were causing this devaluation. So you couldn't necessarily pin it on Petro's energy transition specifically. But of course, that hasn't stopped fossil fuel incumbents saying, oh no, of course, like Petro's anti-energy fossil fuel and mining rhetoric has led to the devaluation of the peso. I don't think you could isolate it in that way. So a mixture of factors. But there's absolutely no question that for Colombia to orchestrate this economic transition away from fossil fuels is going to be incredibly tricky. But the Petro government definitely deserves a lot of credit for starting this conversation. And incidentally, a report came out from Willis Tower Watson's and Universidad de los Andes saying that if Colombia doesn't orchestrate a gradual energy transition starting now, the economic losses could be up to 88 billion by 2050. So this idea of the energy transition not occurring being an economic risk has not really featured much in the debate. And incidentally, it was only one Colombian newspaper, as far as I'm aware, El Espectador, which has a slightly more balanced approach to these issues compared to some other publications covering these issues in Colombia. They had a press note about this report. Hardly any other Colombian media sources did. So I think there's this idea of silencing of information or research which supports an energy transition, which goes against this very mainstream view that fossil fuels and the mining industry are essential for Colombia's economy. Anything that diverges from that is economic and social suicide, which is clearly not the case.
Thanks very much to Guy Edwards for his time. If you're interested in our podcast blurb, you'll find a selection of links to Guy's suggested further reading on this issue. Thanks also to Vasco Kostovsky for audio engineering the show. And as usual, we'll be back again in a few weeks' time with a new interview. Thanks for listening.